Hey everyone, and welcome to another Game Explained discussion. I'm your host, Derek Bittner, and I'm joined today by Andre Seekers and John Cartwright to discuss Sony's announcement that they will not be participating in E3 2020. So, let's get right to it. And right off the bat, we have this article from GameIndustry.biz who broke the news, well, before the apparent leak of this whole thing was happening. But according to Sony, they said, after thorough evaluation, SIE has decided not to participate in E3 2020. We have great respect for the ESA as an organization, but we do not feel the vision of E3 2020 is the right venue for what we are focused on this year. We will build upon our global event strategy in 2020 by participating in hundreds of consumer events across the globe. Our focus is on making sure fans feel part of the PlayStation family and have access to play their favorite content. We have a fantastic lineup of titles coming to PlayStation 4, and with the upcoming launch of PlayStation 5, we are truly looking forward to a year of celebration with our fans. And that seems to be the crux of their problem with E3, at least based off this statement and what they've said about E3 in the past. Basically, they want E3 to be much more of a fan-focused event rather than an industry event, which it's always been up until the sort of half measure that the ESA has taken lately with the past few years. So, how do you guys feel about all this?
I think the interesting thing here, before we get into the nitty-gritty, is that when this happened last year, we were explicitly out loud wondering, what does this mean? And I think we all arrived at the conclusion, well, we'll wait till next year. We'll see. We'll see what they do next year. They'll kind of answer our question. And I think we finally have our answer. I think Sony, it seems like they're done with E3, at least in E3's current form. And I think the real question now is what this means for the competitors. I don't want to get into that quite yet, but I do wonder if this just marks I wonder if this now means like E3 is almost done with. Like that's kind of what I'm getting at here. Like is E3 nearing the end of its time? But as for Sony itself, I mean, clearly they don't think it's worth it. It seems like they're probably going to take, E3 is an expensive event to host, and it seems like they're going to be taking that money that they might put in E3 and just invest it in these other, as they say, hundreds of other consumer-focused events.
Yeah, but it's more than just the consumer-focused events, though. They got State of Play now, which is basically the Nintendo Directs.
Right.
And even Nintendo sort of stepped away from E3 a few years ago by stopping their conferences and just having their very own Directs. So it makes sense for the companies to have, like, full ownership about how they make their announcements rather than be having to be tied to this trade show every single year. It just kind of feels like E3 is a dated concept at this point.
Is that a good thing, though? Because I think a lot of people, like a lot of hardcore fans, or even more casual fans, they look forward to E3. Like, a lot of people describe it as, like, Christmas for gamers, even though it's just advertising and not actually getting anything. Like, a lot of people look forward to the big announcements. That's when they've tended to come out. Even in disappointing years, like, you get some big things there, and it seems like we're not getting that from the very least, at least from Sony anymore. It seems like they're done.
I think the industry's just changed though. Like we don't just get announcements at one point of the year anymore. Like think about Mario Maker 2. That got announced, I believe, was it February of last year and came out in June. So games come out mere months after their announcement. So I don't think it makes sense just to schedule everything around June every single year. Like games come out all the time. They're announced all the time.
Yeah, nothing really limits games anymore. They don't have to worry about getting out there to people in order to advertise their games. That's what E3 was all about. It's like, here's the big new games that are coming this year. Look at them all in one place and get excited for them. But now with the way things have become, it's not really a necessity. You can find out about these games and be good to go. The hardcore gamers will know about your games and it'll get written about and spread all around. And it makes sense that Sony takes the money that they would spend on one E3 and have to directly compete with both Nintendo and Microsoft and whoever else is there, and instead spread it out among all these trade shows that are probably a lot cheaper, and just get their games out that way, or host events, or whatever they might do. But as Nintendo has kind of proven, big game announcements can happen at any time. You put that game out there, people will start talking about it, and if they can start upping the quality of their state of plays to a Nintendo Direct level, I think it could really work for Sony. The last one might have even been to that level because we got Resident Evil 3 announced during a state of play. Now, granted, it leaked before that, but that is a big game. Resident Evil 2 was a huge game for last year, and that was announced at, I believe, E3. So yeah, now we're going from E3 to a state of play for the sequel. And I think that just shows kind of where E3's kind of fallen behind.
And like Resident Evil 3 was announced in December, and it's launching in April. There was no need to like hang on like from June. That 4-month period is fine for that game. It didn't need an entire year just to stew in the public consciousness. Some games just don't need that.
Derek, you kept comparing it to Nintendo Direct, but the interesting thing is Nintendo's nailed the Direct format by and large, and yet they're still at E3. Even as John said, like even they're somewhat stepped back from E3 by getting rid of press conferences. To the end consumer, that didn't really mean anything. They still have their Direct. That's effectively their press conference. They're still at E3. Why isn't Sony? Why do you think this move makes sense for Sony, but not so much for, say, Nintendo, who stuck with the show?
I think it makes sense for Nintendo to still be there because a lot of their stuff is their own stuff. They are very much their sales are driven very much from their first party pieces of hardware and pieces of software. So people want to know about the Nintendo games, and with the bigger focus on the fan aspect to it and just getting it out there to the industry, I think it works more for Nintendo. Sony's first party offerings, they're much more spread out as far as their releases. They're still very good, but they're not as, not every big Sony game matters. Like, what was it, Days Gone? Like, yeah, they pushed it, but that's not going to turn heads. Everybody kind of wants to know about most Nintendo games, and I think that's where the big difference is. So it works for Sony that they can sort of spread this out, wait till they're ready to show off their first-party games or whatever they're trying to push, and save it for a state of play. That way they don't have to cram everything into NE3.
It's also worth noting that Sony is the market leader right now, and I feel like they can do these bold moves at this point. We'll see what happens next gen, because obviously Xbox could take over from PlayStation 5. But as of right now, I think they're in a position where they can kind of try and encourage their competitors to also drop out of E3 eventually.
I do wonder if Sony leaving E3 is better or worse for Nintendo and Microsoft. Like, there's less competition at E3 time, so that might mean that they're able to be in the public conscious more than they were before, because they're competing with less news. On the other hand, are there less eyeballs overall on E3 now that Sony's dropped out? I'm not quite. I wonder how that. I wonder how those metrics shake out.
Well, I mean, you guys have been to a bunch of E3s, but last year, of course, Sony wasn't there. So, what was the show floor like in comparison to previous years for you guys?
Easier to get around on.
It's more convenient, I guess.
And from the press side of things, it was great, actually. But I mean, there was also, I felt like, less excitement. I think maybe overall, like it felt. I mean, maybe it just was the smaller amount of people, but it just felt like there was less hype around the show in general.
It really felt like there was a gap because you'd always have Nintendo, and right across the aisle was Sony, and instead there was really nothing. There's nothing really filling that space of any great value, and so it did really feel like there was a hole there. And you still had other, plenty of Sony products because third-party companies demoing on PlayStation 4 units and stuff like that, but it did feel a bit emptier, and I think that's the great feeling I've been getting from E3s as time has gone on. It's just becoming less and less.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I mean, E3 basically started off as a way to showcase your games to, in the early 90s or mid-90s to press and game stores and, other industry folk to get them to understand your game, and then the news would, of course, be spread via magazines and whatever outlets there were, eventually websites. But as time has gone on, the need to centralize this news has become less important because it's, the internet's kind of a thing now, a big thing. We can all stream these, I mean, you can even stream games instantly now. So you don't need the central location anymore to have the press all play your games in order to share the news about it. As you guys were saying earlier, you can do it in any number of forms now, whether it's direct, state of plays, press releases, individual trailers. It doesn't matter. There's no shortage of ways of getting the news out now, and that includes other industry events. Another big change here now is, even in the last 10 years, there are so many more consumer-focused events now than there were when E3 was starting, or even in its first 10 years, and even since, PAX, I think, kind of started that, and even since then, there's been tons of other conventions. There's too many games, there's MAGFest, there's any number that I can't recall off the top of my head. There's so many.
Yeah, that's an interesting point there, Andre. E3 is an American event, and the gaming industry is global. So people in Japan, people in Europe, they have to travel over to America for this event to play these games. So I think it does make sense to just sort of spread out to dozens of other events across the entire world. And I quite often see the consensus that that E3 demo should just be put on publicly online for everyone. But we have seen previously, well, just recently, with Final Fantasy VII Remake, where it's just blown open. So I don't think it's necessarily a good idea to give the public all these E3 demos, because they will go through the data and find a bunch of stuff they're not meant to.
And a lot of times those demos have a very strict time limit, so you can't really, that way you can't see everything and what they're all up to. So I don't know if that demo format really works, but I still think getting that information out there, having a more controlled, it's still easier to do. And as you said, it's global. People talk about Gamescom. We still have TGS. There's these other events that do hit a global market and people will still talk about. E3 is just sort of another one that's losing its focus.
It's kind of wild, though, that Sony's making this. I mean, I think a big part of why we were wondering whether this was a sign of things to come last year was because last year Sony didn't have much to show. The PS4, it's nearing the end of its lifespan. Everyone knew the PS5 was coming. So I think a lot of us figured, well, they're probably skipping this year because they just don't have much, but they'll be back next year when they have the PS5 and they need to blow it out because it's coming out not terribly long after. And they're skipping it entirely. It seems like they're going to do their own thing. Who knows when they'll, fully blow out the doors on it. Maybe before E3, maybe after. We don't know at this point.
Look at Microsoft. They revealed the Xbox Series X at the Game Awards.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That's another good point.
Granted, that landed with a thud because I didn't know what the heck I was looking at, but still, that's what they chose to show it, not E3.
You were looking at the monolith from 2001, Derek.
Yeah, there you go.
I guess with the PS5, they now have the ability to just sprinkle information out around, across the year. But there's no need to do it all at one place. They can do some of it at the start of the year, some of it in the middle, some of it at the end, and it doesn't have to be tied to just one occasion. And I think right now, State of Plays are good, but people don't get excited for them in the same way they do as Directs. People get so thirsty and hyped for Directs because they've been groomed into it over the years. So there might reach a point where people just lose their minds over the announcement or speculation of a State of Play. I think we'll get there eventually, and maybe leaving E3 is what's going to cause that. They need those big games in these State of Plays, so why waste it on E3?
Mm-hmm. And Sony kind of proved to themselves that they don't really need anybody to hype them up for it. They can put out information and people will talk about it. Just look at the logo for PlayStation 5. That got trending even though it's a very minor change.
God, yeah, calling it a change is being generous.
Yeah.
I think I said it before, it was literally some guy in Photoshop hitting backspace and typing 5. But I think the more interesting thing is, what do you think this means now for Microsoft and Sony? I think correct me if I'm wrong, I believe Microsoft, did they already reaffirm that they will be at E3 this year?
I'm not sure, but of course they have the Microsoft Studios, Microsoft Theater, so they probably are going to take advantage of that. But
and Nintendo, though, is still technically up in the air. We don't know for sure they'll be there or not this year.
That's true.
Mm-hmm. As far as I know, I don't know if the booth announcements have been revealed yet. I don't think they have. So what do you think this means for them? Do you expect to see both back this year? And if so, do you expect to see them in the coming years?
I can't see Microsoft skipping E3. I think Sony not being there is an advantage to them because they have more, more floor space and also more eyes on them without PlayStation at E3.
Yeah.
Nintendo though, that's an oddball because they were technically the first to move away from E3, even if they are still at the show. But yeah, I really don't know. They could skip the show. I could see them doing it. I don't know if I expect them to though.
Yeah, I don't expect them to skip it. Maybe next year. I think. Sony got the ball rolling. They kept it rolling, and now it's going to see if it gathers up everybody else to see if they're just going to go along for the ride with Sony at this point to see if Sony launches the PlayStation 5 and it is a massive success, even without the E3, which technically Nintendo also did with the Switch. Everybody thought Nintendo was crazy for launching it in March and not November and having no E3 presence for it. And yet, look at the Switch. So Sony could do the same.
2 months before the consoles launched, they had that presentation.
Yeah, exactly.
However, they had been showing off the launch title effectively for the Switch a couple years before then at E3.
And Sony could keep doing the same thing. They might be able to just say, hey, it's Last of Us Part 2, also coming out on PlayStation 5, and look how much better it looks. Do the dual launch thing that Legend of Zelda did.
Are you guys personally happy about this news, or are you disappointed?
I mean, I'm more of a Sony guy than a Microsoft guy in the first place, so it is a little disappointing, but it's so hard to check out those games at the Sony booths and whatnot. And you were actually there for their final press conference, which was kind of a mess. where they shuffled you from room to
That's
room
right.
before doing the final one. So I don't think it's a huge deal. I mean, it sucks to some degree, but it's also, I don't affect us personally that much. It's hard to say.
Not yet.
Yeah, not much.
Well, you think
not
think
yet.
back to their previous years though. Like most of Sony's press conferences from like E3 2015 onwards have just been trailer reels. Like they don't really stop to do speeches anymore. They just keep running trailer after trailer. And like you go back and watch press conferences from like 2004, and they give you PowerPoint slides on their sales. They're so different how they are today, and they barely even talk about games. So I think press conferences have evolved to the point where they may as well just be pre-recorded videos, because there's apart from the audience reaction, there's nothing else that really benefits from doing a live show.
What do you think this means for E3? Like, are they going to try and change their show to try and mitigate these factors? We've already seen them go into the more fan side of things by opening up to some amount of fans. I think more last year than even the year before. What do you think they're going to do in reaction to this?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Because, yeah, they might be opening up to more fans, but if the big companies are not going to be there, what impetus is there to fans to actually go to it? Because it's not like other cons. There's no panels. There's no, they can't go to the Microsoft press conferences or what, EA's or whoever's, Ubisoft's that might be there. That's why we kind of argued against fans even bothering to go to E3 in the first place, because yeah, it's cool, but if you're not press, you're going to be waiting in lines for most of the time for the small chance to play these games. And yeah, that's fun in its own right to try these games early and see what they're all about and have all that, but it's just without the extra things that cons typically have. I mean, E3 would have to be drastically rearranged to become more like other cons at that point. And at that point, E3 is essentially dead.
I can see them doing that exactly, though. I mean, in 2019, I saw people like dressed in cosplay at E3. I think that's really just the direction they're going to go in, like make those panels and make it more like other cons. But I guess still keeping that grander focus on unreleased games. But yeah, they're definitely going to go more to the consumer side over time.
Yeah, I question if they'll be around long enough to do so. I mean, I think they may have started too late, and I think there's just too much competition now to have their own identities. I don't know what room there is really for E3 left. Like, their identity is being able to see and play big announcements, and if those big announcements cease to be a thing, I don't know what purpose E3 serves. Unless they, maybe they can adjust their timing to work better with these game companies. If that is a problem, if June isn't the ideal time for them, but I don't know there is ever a consistent ideal time for all three.
I mean, like, right now, it feels like it's always E3. There's always a direct speculation thread on some forum, people are always thinking about the next big thing, and sometimes just a general direct can be better than an E3 direct. I just don't think they need to, stick to this schedule the entire time.
Yeah, no, they definitely don't. Yeah, I mean, we've seen this. I mean, where that one year where Nintendo only had Breath of the Wild there. That was literally the only game, and I think it would probably have done fine. I think the game probably would have sold just fine had they not even been at E3 that year, honestly. But it's impossible to say for sure, of course.
I mean, all things considered, I think Sony will be just fine. I think I think E3 needs Sony more than Sony needs E3.
For sure. And Sony can use this opportunity to just hype up their games to a much better extent, because they're not showing them all at once. So in March they can show Bloodborne 2, in June they can show whatever, and in August they can show whatever. It's just a great way to just sort of get your lineup out there, and it keeps people from forgetting about certain games.
This is going to be such an interesting year to see what happens, because I think you're right, Derek. I think E3 does need Sony more than Sony needs E3, but it will be interesting to see, if that pans out, just to see how Sony and Microsoft end up competing with one another. And even then, who knows if E3 had any bearing on those results at all. But it will be interesting to see what happens there. Like, if the PS5 launches and underperforms, I wonder if it'll make Sony think, maybe we should have been E3 this year.
Maybe. Yeah. We'll find out. It's going to be a wild year, it feels like. Yeah.
Do you guys think that E3 is known to the general public? I think with social media, news just kind of spreads. Like, Final Fantasy VII Remake was announced at E3, but I don't think your average consumer knows that, though. I think they just know the game was announced. So is social media bigger now?
I would bet you more people know E3 than they do of either Nintendo Directs or State of Plays individually.
True.
Maybe, yeah. I think just because of social media, just because of Twitter and Facebook and all that, I think people just find out game news regardless. It doesn't matter where it's announced.
Yeah, I agree.
It doesn't, but I think that's part. I think that's part of the appeal of E3 in that when you're watching social media, you're watching it. You're aware of things you're already familiar with. Whereas E3 is kind of a venue to find out about things that you may not have been interested in. It's a great way of finding out about things you may not have been keeping an eye on. Like I think I think a lot of people that don't even own a PlayStation or Xbox or even Nintendo consoles, they tune into these conferences because they're there, they're happening, they're big news at E3. Whereas if it were just a state of play, I don't know if it would have the same effect. I'm positive it wouldn't. I don't think as many people would be tuning into a state of play as they would a Nintendo or a Sony press conference.
Yeah, that's probably true. When you look at like Nintendo Direct views, though, I think some of them do match their E3 ones. The E3 is always one of the higher ones, but depending on what they show or what they hint at or what the lead up to the event is, I think you can still get like a pretty high viewership, like something that does match E3.
Yeah, again, it's going to be a gradual change. We're still seeing that pendulum swing, perhaps in the other direction. And yeah, the E3 still carries some weight to it because that's what we've been groomed to know. But as time goes on, I think it'll just become less and less important. And E3 is just, I talk about it, and it's not as widely known because you talk about E3 and everybody will know what you're talking about. And these days, it's like, oh, what's that again? It's just. It's not a huge thing anymore.
I think a point worth bringing up, though, is that this isn't the first time E3 has been up against the ropes. I think it was 07 to 08 or 08 to 09. There was those weird couple of years where they were like in airplane hangars or they were like in just a hallway at E3 or at the convention center. They had a weird couple of years there before they kind of got back on track, closer to what they were before. I think E3 is kind of like a cockroach. I don't know if you can fully kill it. It may be around forever in some form.
We'll see.
Yeah, we will see.
Well, any other thoughts on Sony skipping E3 2020?
No.
All right.
You covered it.
All right.
As long as State of Play has Bloodborne 2, I'm happy, Derek.
There you go. All right, well, I guess that covers it for our Sony skipping E3 discussion and the viability of E3 in the future. So we'll see what happens, but in the meantime, thank you for watching, and if you liked this video, be sure to like us on Facebook and Twitter at GameXplain, and of course be sure to subscribe to GameXplain for more on Sony, Nintendo, Microsoft, everybody, and E3, and other things gaming as well. Until next time, bye.